Hello, friend. I got lost in making stupid YouTube videos for a couple of years, but I am back here now as a voice, which is to say as a soul. I have always experienced voices as the essence of the human creature. Everything else, we might say, is merely a kind of shell or cage. The most horrifying thing about art is its honesty, writes Anneli Rufus in her book Party of One, Alone as Manifesto. The truth lashed to the mast. This too, she writes, makes artists loners and loners artists. It is the tendency of the recipient to kill the messenger. I wasn't sure what this last line meant when I read it this morning, so I asked G, who explained that the recipient here is whoever encounters these words, which is to say you, and the messenger is, well, me. The recipient, you, kills the messenger, me, or more likely, as we are here online, clicks away, because the message, or maybe even the tone or delivery of the message, doesn't gratify in some way the recipient's sense of self or their idea of others. Melancholic, pessimistic utterances often threaten the psychic safety of their recipients, threatening the ways in which the recipient maintains coherence, innocence, superiority, or belonging in the culture and its dominant narratives. The psyche of the recipient defends itself with boredom, indifference, intellectual dismissal, or moral outrage in order to keep these out-of-place utterances at bay. As a strategy, writes Anneli, some artists hide, some go mad, some get angry, whilst others cut their traces and construct for themselves a world within a world. Whatever I have been doing in my various online projects over the years is very much, I would say, a world within a world. I just wish this world were populated with one or two voices other than my own, but some worlds struggle to bring others into them. The world of the loner is such a world for one, as Anneli describes it. There is much talk in this book of art and artists. I think Anneli probably considers herself to be one of these artists and her book a form of art. But what does that word even mean in the age of content? The word art, etymologically speaking, does not in fact point towards transcendence, as it is often implied, so much as suggesting a skillful kind of making. From the Proto-Indo-European root ar, meaning to fit together, to join, to arrange. Art names a careful assembling of elements into a form that holds, whether as armor, a tool, an argument, or an entire human world. Art is fundamentally about craft and technique, but also cunning, artifice, trickery. We are all plagiarists, borrowers, thieves, working with inherited forms, recycled gestures, second-hand language. Art is not an aesthetic luxury so much as a functional shelter, deliberately made so that something fragile, the human psyche with all of its contradictory aspirations, yearnings, and melancholia, might for a while find a kind of home within the structure of the artifact, whether through the act of making it, writing it, saying it, as I'm doing here, or through attending to what has been made, which is to say you, listening from the other side of your screen, maybe even thinking, how the fuck did this get into my feed today? Both you and me consume and create art in order to remain coherent, bearable, livable to ourselves, as well as, oh so briefly, unless you're getting lost in a multi-season TV show or a big novel, a tad less isolated inside our various ego cages. Or if you prefer a less jarring term, inside the enclosing condition, apparatus and confinement of our bodies, hearts and minds. This is perhaps also where art begins to shade into its degraded contemporary cousin, content, a word that I've grown to despise with every ounce of my being in the last 2 years on YouTube. Etymologically speaking, content still carries that sense of being held together, but also of being contained and restrained. Its primary sense is passive. Content is what lies inside a vessel. Content is Coca-Cola. Content is advertising. Content is defined not by what it is, but by where it goes and how efficiently it fills us up. It is fundamentally interchangeable by design. One piece replaces another without any loss whatsoever. Jimmy Donaldson, aka Mr. Beast, could drop dead tomorrow, I live in hope, and 1,000 iterations of his do anything to make a buck, make a subscriber, get a like persona would fill Jimmy's philanthropro shoes in an instant. In fact, the dude doesn't even have to cop it for this to occur, because already there are hundreds of wannabe Mr. Beasts on the platform churning out spectacle-driven versions of his charity as entertainment shtick, and in a few decades, most likely there will be millions of these algorithmically fluent do-gooders filling our minds with the same virtue-polished dreck. But art, at least in its dictionary definition, something created with imagination and skill that is beautiful or that expresses important ideas or feelings, I don't know, seems too high-minded a word for what Anneli or I are doing. Still, I dread to think that we are making content. Fuck that. When art is reframed as content, instead of a world being constructed to serve a personally meaningful interior life or some other existential objective, our work, our ideas, even our emotional responses are simply reduced to inputs that serve a system. Art builds a world within a world. Content fills a pre-existing one. It is a metaphysical downgrade, we could say, relocating expression from the domain of world building and expressive making into the domain of management and optimization. And yet, part of me suspects that this is exactly what we now deserve as a species. I mean, we've brought this all on ourselves, haven't we? Or at least our technologies have brought it upon us, and there's no going back now. Things are only going to get more addictive, more compulsive, more inescapable. Think about it. On any given day, a huge number of this planet's connected population, maybe even half, seriously, half of the 8 billion so-called individualists out there who all want a slice of the attention and validation pie, are producing content in some shape or form. Historically, this was never the case. For almost all of human history, communicative acts that reached beyond one's immediate circle were radically constrained by material conditions. Literacy was rare. Writing materials were scarce. Transmission was slow. Audience size was tiny. In the age of Plato and Socrates, perhaps a few hundred people in the entire Greek world were producing public-facing discourse. And even then, most of it was oral, local, ephemeral. Socrates did not produce content. He just prattled away and argued his point, as we all do with whoever happened to be there. Plato's dialogues circulated among a minute elite, copied by hand, read by almost no one for centuries. The idea of speaking to an abstract audience like I'm doing here would have been unintelligible. So no wonder it feels so fucking strange and frankly inhuman to be doing so. It would, for the Greeks, have signaled a kind of madness or delusional hubris. And of course both of these claims are entirely true. Why does almost every person I now speak to in my role as a counselor or therapist strongly identify with or arrive at the consultation session carrying an ADHD or some other neurodiversity diagnosis, usually explained through the faith of my own therapeutic orthodoxy, those psychological salvation narratives now endlessly reinforced by YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok, all folded neatly into that other buzzword of the moment, trauma. Are you sad, anxious, and lost, my friend? Yeah, me too. Existential finitude, contingency, powerlessness, as well as the dawning recognition that the entire human project is now moving at an incredible clip towards untold, catastrophic, systemic, and irreversible, painful, horrific outcomes is a little bit of a downer, isn't it? Oh no, Steve, the reason I'm sad, anxious, and lost is because I have ADHD and unresolved childhood-adjacent trauma, a refrain I too sometimes tell the self, myself, who suffers. And much of that is, in a narrow sense, true, but also it is a psychotherapeutic narrative. Before Freud, people had shitty lives, but no one talked about trauma, and they were no more miserable than we are. We come to therapy because we are suffering and looking for answers, and therapy culture gives us answers. But so what? The answer that I'm currently looking for is to the question, why, dear God, have I spent the last 2 years making 200 pieces of content on YouTube? Oh my God. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. As a loner, the answer must surely be because I have no other consistently available way of meeting my mammalian primate hunger and your mammalian primate hunger for attention, recognition, and social contact, other than, nowadays, by watching YouTube, listening to podcasts, and of course good old reading, thank God, books, my friends for life. Of course, I still try to place myself in offline settings, 5 rhythms, meetups, that sort of thing. Each year, usually in the summer, I enroll in some form of group-based activity with other humans, long-form improv, poetry, pottery being the most recent examples, and always with the implicit or explicit aim of coaxing some genuinely organic relationship into being. But unfortunately for me, and maybe for you too, these awkward, slow, unscripted human conversations compete all too poorly with the immediacy, stimulation, and low-risk engagement that waits at home on our screens. Human primates, especially young, attractive human primates, will of course continue to associate somewhat, even that is down as we know, for sex, dating, or romantic pairings, but sustained companionship has become much harder to maintain in the age of WhatsApp and Instagram, and mutual boredom is far more common than before. Content increasingly substitutes for companionship. As a result, people like myself, without a partner and without friends beyond a few virtual contacts, are no longer the marginal outliers, but an increasingly common condition. Not that this helps us feel any better about ourselves. I mean, personally, I still feel most of the time like a weird social aberration, a sort of maladaptive and miswired freak in my repeated inability to draw friends and lovers into my life, as if this were an inherently personal failure on my part. And who knows? Maybe it is. Maybe it is. I picked up Anneli's book from the shelves today, thinking I might reread it or maybe just revisit the lines that I'd, penciled next to certain sentences or paragraphs to see if they still held some resonance to warrant inclusion in my commonplace book. I'm sort of keeping a commonplace of quotes that I love and that sort of resonate with my soul. Leafing through the chapter on love and sex, I also saw that a previous me had not only underlined, but in fact circled the following very brief admission on page 80 of Anneli's book. Quote, "I am married to a loner. That makes two of us." I don't normally write in books, but if I had to, I think I might have penned, somewhat peevishly or enviously, next to this comment, something like, "Screw you, Anneli Rufus. For the last 79 pages you have been assiduously presenting your bona fides as a loner, an artist, a misfit, a dissenter, and all this time you've had this significant other beside you, this chosen other, Kristen Lawson, who has also chosen you to share their life with." Anneli. But also, it makes sense that this would be your literal as opposed to page-filling persona, because as ungracious as this is going to maybe sound, the cohesion and containment required for writing and publishing a book, not just, some sort of self-published, vanity-published bullshit. No, a real book through a publisher, through the gatekeeper of a publisher, absolutely needs, I would say, one other embodied human, not only in your corner, but physically in your life, there beside you, and your prevaricating insufficient self, doing all of that supportive rah-rah and effective stabilization. Even Kafka, let us remember, had Brod and Felice Bauer. Without them, we would never even have heard of that neurotic little twerp. Pessoa had Sacarnero, Dickinson had Susan Gilbert, Woolf had Leonard, and Anneli, the author of this sort of self-helpy loner's manifesto with its soothing promise that you too can thrive as a loner through solitude, self-reliance, and carefully managed social distance, turns out to have had a fiercely loyal, emotionally invested spouse all this time. Oh, what a shock. But also, my own corrosive resentment, envy, bitterness, all duly noted. Here's another good quote from the book, one that's going into my commonplace. "From the dawn of civilization onward, interdependence has been the best weapon. You chop trees, with which I build a boat, in which he catches fish, which she hawks, and they buy. Loners who step out of the loop exempt themselves from mercy as well as any social legibility. It is the cooperative ant that survives famines, not the selfish grasshopper. Whoever isn't with us is against us, is the old shout that puts loners right down there with pillagers and rapists. When extinction looms, loners who shun the family way might as well be murderers too. Each time, place, and culture makes its own rules for how to be a model citizen. Being a loner usually means smashing all of those rules simply by breathing." It's hard not to write about being a loner without falling into a sort of self-pitying stance. I pick up the Book of Disquiet, as I often do, and almost the first passage my eyes alight on is this. This book is a lament, he writes in fragment 412 of the Zenith edition, quote, "Once written, it will replace Alone as the saddest book in Portugal." That is true, Fernando, that is true. "The splendor of a beautiful sunset saddens me with its beauty. When gazing at one, I always think, what a thrill it must be for a happy man to see this. I myself always think, what a thrill this must be to see this with another. Next to my pain, all other pains seem unreal or insignificant. They are the pains of people who are happy or who live life and complain. My pains are those of a man who finds himself incarcerated, cut off from life. Between me and life, ... And so I see all the things which cause anguish and feel none of the things which bring joy. And I've noticed that suffering is seen more than felt, whereas happiness is felt more than seen. Because if one doesn't see or think, he will know a certain contentment, like that of the mystics and the Bohemians. It's by the door of thought and the window of observation that suffering comes into one's house. Self-pity, as we know, has always been treated as a moral offence, largely because modern moral cultures hate states that do not mobilize, optimize, or redeem themselves with alacrity. But etymologically and philosophically, self-pity points to something far less contemptible and far more primordial. The word pity, as you may know, comes from the Latin pietas as well as the Greek word eleos. Pietas names a posture of care, devotion, and responsiveness to what has been given and cannot be undone. It is the root of piety, not in the religious sense of obedience, but in the older sense of tending to what one has inherited, one's parents, one's fate, one's condition in life. Eleos names an unsettled recognition of a form of suffering that cannot be corrected by reason or command, and probably not even by therapy. This, we might say, is pre-moral. It happens before judgment descends. Thus, to pity is to stay with what hurts without immediately converting it into action or blame or transcendence. Transcendence, of course, being the number one move for those pontificating preachers of productivity, resilience, and self-mastery on YouTube and elsewhere. In phenomenological terms, self-pity is an effective disclosure of finitude. It reveals the self not as a sovereign agent, but as an exposed, time-bound, and dependent creature. Even the Stoics, who publicly scorned self-pity, privately relied on a disciplined version of it, a lucid acknowledgement of what lies outside of one's control. Grant me the serenity to accept the things, which is to say, the social conditions, my own living, working, temperamental circumstances, that cannot be changed. Or that could, but only if I were willing to change something that is functionally workable on the off chance that this change will put me in the vicinity of more like-minded friends or, partner-seeking humans. And I no longer hold faith in that claim. Not really. The reason self-pity is morally despised is not because it is empty, but because it refuses conversion. It does not immediately become virtue, resilience, gratitude, or growth. It does not serve the economy of character, we might say. I, myself, inwardly roll my eyes at times with clients who are often in similar setups to me when they start, wanging on about how alone and lonely they are. Transference 101, right? I can be there with them for this hour. I can give myself fully, wholly to them, but I have no redemptive messages to offer. Language, logos, to whom the therapist is servant, has nothing to offer them. Well, at least this therapist has nothing to offer them other than perhaps the pablum of reframing or the, moralism of relational seeking and social optimization. Ontologically, self-pity is the point at which suffering is neither externalized into grievance nor sublimated into meaning. It is suffering recognized as one's own without any alibis. In that sense, it is far closer to mourning, we could say, than to narcissism. But the focus of the mourning is somewhat different to what it usually is. Mourning usually laments the loss of an object or a relationship, but self-pity mourns the thwarted self, a life that was constrained, interrupted, or quietly misspent before it could fully be lived. Which is only to say that, the YouTube algorithm, as a somewhat crude but incredibly powerful moral agent, will understandably not countenance, for the most part, individual self-pity. It is a system that is optimized for signals that scale. Frequency of engagement, velocity of response, predictability of audience clustering and emotional arousal that can be replicated across large numbers of viewers. One-to-one address fails on all 4 of these counts. And let's be clear here, I was not putting out wah, poor me, self-pitying videos. I was genuinely trying to create interesting, educational, informative content. Didn't work. YouTube is a very groupist kind of space, right? Look at how it delivers content that pits one group against another, men against women, women against men being, the sort of obvious example. It's all this groupist logic. It's not ever really about one soul reaching out to another soul. Of course not. One soul addressing just one other soul is not really good for business, is it? I mean, if that's your MO, buddy, says the YouTube algorithm, go speed dating, write a letter to Fernando Pessoa, make a podcast, but do not try using our platform for finding connections. So, okay, after 2 years, I am listening, finally, to YouTube. And coming back here. Which is to say, returning to you, Fernando. Returning to you. Keeping faith in these virtual message in a bottle expressions is clearly not a growth strategy, whether personal growth, relational growth, or otherwise, so much, for me anyway, as a sanity or survival tactic. And I think it is a sanity and a survival tactic for all the loners of this world. Silent self-pity corrodes and isolates us, at least mine does, whereas expression potentially preserves, first and foremost, contact with ourselves, but also occasionally, contingently, with another. I live in hope. Hope is a much more fragile and delusory place to live than despair, but Jesus Christ, I say, grant us, dear Lord, this small refuge of hope on Friday the 9th of January, 2026. Grant all of us loners a little smidgen of hope that we get the listeners, the friends, the companions we need and who need us.